Jefferson had lived in the crooked stone cottage on the hill since her husband passed, a reclusive widow and silent presence that the village preferred to keep at a distance. Her cottage was weather-beaten and ancient, surrounded by a tangle of overgrown brambles and vines that seemed to protect it like a natural fortress. Though Elaine was neither witch nor healer, the townsfolk had let superstitions take root, fed by her unusual looks, bent frame, clawed hands, eyes that shone like flints in a fire. With nothing left to anchor her to the town below, Elaine had little reason to mingle with its people. She lived quietly, accepting their judgment as a strange, twisted form of peace. Children, when daring each other, would rush up the path to her house, only to flee back to their parents, breathless with imagined terror. "She's a witch," they'd whisper, caught up in tales spun by parents who'd grown up believing the same thing. She didn't mind. It was better to be left alone than harassed. And though the tales painted her as a dangerous creature, she was content to let them linger. One late autumn afternoon, the village children were playing in the woods that stretched near the base of Elaine's hill. 7-year-old Cindy, a curious and fearless girl with tousled curls, was playing hide-and-seek with her friends. As she ducked under branches and skipped over roots, she hardly noticed the deepening gray of the sky or the shivering wind that slipped through the trees, whispering of rain. When the storm hit, it came without warning. A sharp, icy rain whipped through the woods, and the winds were strong enough to shake branches loose. Cindy's friends scattered in a rush, crying out to each other as they ran back toward the village, but Cindy, lost in the thick of the trees, went in the wrong direction. As she stumbled blindly through the underbrush, she slipped on wet leaves and tumbled down a steep embankment, her foot catching on a gnarled root. She felt a sharp, blinding pain shoot through her leg and screamed. She lay on the ground, rain drumming down on her as the sky roared and flashed with lightning. She tried to crawl, but her leg refused to move, agony shooting through her every time she tried. Terrified, Cindy cried out for her parents, for her friends, but only the storm answered back. It was nearly dark when Elaine heard the cries. Reluctantly, she picked up her lantern and made her way down the hill, following the faint, weakening voice. It didn't take her long to find Cindy, shivering and drenched, her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. The girl looked up at Elaine in horror as she approached, the pale eyes and crooked smile confirming every fear that had been instilled in her young mind. But Elaine had never been a cruel woman, despite her solitude. She crouched down beside Cindy, her voice a soft, raspy murmur. "Don't be afraid. I won't harm you, child. We need to get you out of this rain." Cindy, still trembling, nodded, unable to argue as the pain in her leg overpowered her fright. Elaine lifted her as gently as she could, feeling the girl's small body stiffen, and carried her up the muddy slope to her cottage on the hill. Inside, the air was warm, thick with the earthy smell of dried herbs and wood smoke. Elaine laid Cindy on a rough but clean cot by the hearth, covered her with a thick woolen blanket, and began inspecting the injury. The girl winced, clutching the blanket, as Elaine spoke in gentle tones, explaining that her leg was badly sprained but not broken. "This will hurt, but it'll help," Elaine murmured as she prepared a poultice. She crushed herbs with a practiced hand, spreading the mixture over Cindy's swollen ankle. It burned at first, but soon Cindy felt a strange coolness as the pain dulled. Elaine bandaged the ankle carefully and placed a steaming mug of herbal tea beside the bed. "Drink, it'll calm you," she said, a faint smile flickering over her lips. Hours passed and the storm died down, though the wind still howled in the trees outside. Elaine sat beside Cindy, her wrinkled hands knitting, while the girl drifted in and out of sleep. She had never imagined this old woman as anything but a monstrous figure. Now she saw her as an ordinary person, just weathered by age, her movements slow but tender. Eventually, after a long silence, Cindy whispered, Thank you. Elaine nodded, her eyes distant. I've had my share of injuries, child. Living alone, you learn to mend yourself. In the early hours of dawn, the girl's parents came searching, desperate and frantic, led by a group of villagers holding torches and weapons as though hunting a beast. When they reached the cottage, the crowd stopped in its tracks, fearful to cross Elaine's doorstep. Cindy's father, George, pushed his way to the front, his voice loud and full of accusation. "What have you done with our daughter, witch?" he demanded. Elaine opened the door, her face shadowed by the faint light of dawn behind her. She did not flinch at the accusation. Instead, she stepped aside, allowing them to see the child resting peacefully in her cot. Cindy's mother, Betty, rushed inside, gathering her daughter in her arms with tears streaming down her face. But George still eyed Elaine with suspicion, his jaw tight. "What spell did you put on her?" he demanded. Elaine's voice was calm, though a hint of sadness edged it. "No spells here, George, just herbs and care. The girl was injured. I did what anyone would." One of the older villagers, a man named Tom, looked around the cottage, frowning as if trying to spot any hint of dark magic. But he saw only the simple tools of a healer: dried herbs, clay pots, neatly arranged bandages. He cleared his throat, catching George's arm. "George," he said quietly, "seems like she saved the girl." George's face softened slightly as he took in the room, then his gaze turned to Elaine. For the first time he noticed how frail she looked, how her shoulders sagged under the weight of loneliness. As the villagers whispered among themselves, Elaine simply watched, waiting for them to leave. Finally, Cindy's mother turned to her, her voice shaky. "Thank you for what you did. We would have lost her without you." Elaine offered only a nod. "Go on now. The girl needs rest." The villagers left the cottage, their heads lowered in shame or unease, unwilling to look Elaine in the eye. As they made their way back down the hill, they whispered to each other, the old tales of witches and curses beginning to unravel in the light of morning. A week passed before Cindy's family sent word up the hill, asking if Elaine would come down to the village. They had gathered by the well, the entire town waiting in quiet anticipation, though Elaine knew they still carried traces of fear. George was the first to speak. "We were wrong, Elaine. About you." He looked down, the weight of guilt clear in his voice. "You saved our girl. We should have known better than to believe tales spun out of fear." Elaine studied their faces, feeling the warmth of the sun on her skin and the faint hum of voices she'd missed for so long. "Fear is a strong thing," she said, voice as steady as a stone. "It can make good people do foolish things." Betty stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "You've been a neighbor to us all these years, and we've treated you as anything but. We want to make it right." Elaine glanced at their open faces. For the first time in years, she felt something shift within her, a thaw after a long winter. She took Betty's hand, shaking it briefly, her smile faint but genuine. The children who had huddled behind their parents peeked out, watching with wide eyes. Cindy, her ankle still wrapped but healing, took a bold step forward, her young voice breaking the silence. "Thank you, Miss Elaine," she said, her voice strong, "for taking care of me. I was scared, but you helped me." Elaine's heart softened at the girl's words. "You're a brave child, Cindy, braver than most." After that day, the village's tales of witches and curses faded into memory. Elaine no longer lived as a feared recluse, but as a respected healer, though she still preferred her solitude on the hill. The villagers found themselves seeking her advice, her remedies, her steady hands in times of need, and over the years the children came to know her not as a witch, but as old Miss Elaine. And they all carried a lesson, taught by an unlikely friendship, that stories, especially those born of fear, were seldom true, and that truth was found only by facing one's fears with open eyes and an open heart.